This is a tutorial on how to do the trig identity problems. And so there are a few things that you need to know before you get started. So let me explain a few things. So the first thing that you need to know is that sine squared plus cosine squared always equals 1. And so the next thing is that if you switch around the cosine and the sine, so let's say the sine squared gets subtracted onto the other side, it equals 1 minus sine squared equals cosine squared. And so those two are both equivalent. And so the next thing is basically the opposite. So if the cosine squared was put onto the other side with subtraction, it would equal 1 minus cosine squared, which equals sine squared. And then that can be further switched around. And so the cosine squared minus, so if the 1 was carried over to the other side to make it cosine squared minus 1, you're left with the negative sine squared over here. And then vice versa, the 1 is moved onto this side, so sine squared minus 1 equals cosine squared. Negative cosine squared, sorry. All right, and then now we need to know the trig identities and their inverses. And so the main things that you'll see are cosecant, secant, tangent, and cotangent. And so 1 over sine, so cosecant is the inverse of sine, and the inverse of sine is written as 1 over sine. Secant is the inverse of cosine, and the inverse of cosine is written as 1 over cosine. And then tangent is written as sine over cosine. Always sine over cosine is tangent. And then the inverse of tangent is called cotangent, and cotangent is cosine over sine. So now that we know that, we can continue to the first problem. And the first problem is A on trig identities, and it is sine plus tangent over 1 plus secant. So like we learned before, tangent and secant can be changed into different forms. So let's do that real quick. So this equals sine plus sine over cosine over 1 plus 1 over cosine, since secant is the inverse of cosine. So now that we have a fraction within a fraction, we have to get rid of those by using fraction busters. And the way that you do fraction busters is by finding a common denominator within two of the fractions, which in this case is just cosine. So let me write cosine up here. And we're going to multiply cosine by everything. So the sine would turn into sine cosine, and then the sine over cosine. The cosine would cancel out, leaving just one sine. And this is all over cosine times 1 is cosine, plus the cosine cancels out, and then it just leaves 1. And the next thing that you have to look for in these trig identity problems is factoring. And so you can take out one sine on the top since everything has a sine in it, leaving just cosine plus 1 over cosine plus 1. And since these are the same, you can actually cancel them out, leaving just sine as your answer. And then, so now we can go on to a little bit of a harder one, and it's B. And B is 1 minus sine plus cosine, and that's all squared, all over tangent 1 minus cosine squared. And so what I like to do with these types of problems, I like to just work on the top and then go to the bottom after, because the top needs to be simplified since it's squared. And so since sine plus cosine is squared, there's 2 of those. So I just like to write it onto the side. And so this is, so basically you just FOIL this. So this would turn into sine squared plus sine cosine plus cosine squared. So it would be sine squared plus 2 sine cosine plus cosine squared. But you have to distribute that minus. And so it would be 1 minus sine squared minus 2 sine cosine, and then minus cosine squared. And like we learned before, the 1 minus sine squared right here can be turned into a cosine squared. And so if we turn 1 minus sine squared into cosine squared, like this, the minus cosine, so it'd just be cosine squared minus cosine squared, and they would just cancel out. And so now you're left with this on the top, negative 2 sine cosine, and then on the bottom, you have, so let's write the top, so negative 2 sine cosine over tangent, which is sine over cosine, multiplied by 1 minus cosine squared. And 1 minus cosine squared, like we learned before, can also be written as sine squared. And so if we change that into sine squared, it's being multiplied by the sine over cosine, so it'd just be over 1. It makes it easier. And so you would get negative 2 sine cosine over sine cubed, sorry, I forgot to write it, over cosine. Yeah, and then now that you have a fraction within a fraction, you have to multiply everything by that common denominator. The common denominator in this case is just that cosine. So multiply everything by cosine. Let's get a new page. So it's negative 2 sine cosine over sine cubed over cosine. And multiplying everything by cosine. So you get negative 2 sine cosine squared all over, and then the cosines cancel out, so you are just left with that sine cubed. And since this is sine to the first, you can actually cancel out one of those signs on the bottom to make the sign on the bottom just squared instead of cubed. And so now you're left with negative 2 cosine squared over sine squared. And like we learned before, whenever cosine is on top of sine, you can automatically write it as cotangent. And the directions on the SIG test will say that you have to simplify this down to one single term. And so you want to rewrite that as negative 2 cotangent squared. And then that's it. And so now I'll show you the answers to those other problems on the rest of the worksheet. So this is page 1. I'll leave it on there for a little bit. I'm going to make sure you guys can see this. Sorry, we're having... so this is the answers for the first page. And then let me get you this answers for the second page. Which is right there. And that is it. And that should conclude this tutorial. I hope it helped you. And that is how you do the trig identity problems. Thank you for watching.